Everybody talked about it like it was the finish line. Pay off the house, get to zero, and then, and only then, could you really think about retiring. I heard some version of that sentence probably 100 times in the last decade of my career. From colleagues, from friends at dinner parties, from my own internal monologue, if I'm being completely honest with myself. The image was so clean, the final payment, the piece of paper, the moment where you walk into retirement with nothing hanging over you, nothing owed, nothing unsettled, free. That was the dream. And here is the reality, stated as plainly as I know how to state it. For a lot of women I know, smart, careful, capable women who planned this with everything they had, making the paid-off house the condition of their retirement was one of the most expensive decisions they ever made. Not in the way a financial planner would measure expensive, in the way that actually matters, in years, in presence, in the life they were living while they were waiting to start living. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your money. I genuinely don't know your situation, and I'm not qualified to advise on it. What I can tell you is what I watched happen up close for a long time. And what I've been sorting through in my own head since I retired 3 years ago. Because there is something underneath this particular retirement dream that I don't think we talk about enough. Something the financial conversation almost always misses. And once I name it, I think you're going to recognize it. My name is Linda Calloway. I retired 3 years ago from a 27-year career in human resources, the last 9 as HR director at a regional healthcare system here in Columbus, Ohio. I spent most of that career sitting across from people at various stages of transition, trying to help them understand what they actually wanted versus what they had convinced themselves they wanted. The irony of then fumbling my own transition so thoroughly is not lost on me. I've mentioned it before on this channel, and I'll probably mention it again. I started the unretiring because I thought my professional experience with human change would make my own retirement easier. It didn't. But it gave me a particular way of seeing what went wrong, for me and for a lot of people I've known. If that kind of honest conversation is useful to you, subscribe. It helps me keep doing this. Now, let's talk about the house. Here's what I want you to understand about the mortgage payoff dream and why it's so powerful that it can derail an otherwise clear-headed person. It's not actually about the house. I mean, it's about the house in the practical sense, but the reason it grips people the way it does, the reason it becomes the goal, the organizing principle, the thing retirement is waiting for, is because it's a container. It holds everything. It holds the feeling of having finally done something right, of having honored an obligation in full, of being the kind of person who doesn't leave things unfinished, of having earned, in the most literal possible way, the roof over your head. I spent 27 years watching people navigate the transition out of their professional identities, and one thing I came to understand about high-achieving people, women especially in my experience, is this: we do not do well without a clear finish line. We are, as a group, deeply uncomfortable with the open-ended. We like goals that can be completed. We like the feeling of crossing something off. The mortgage is a goal you can cross off. Retirement, what you're actually going to do with the rest of your life, who you're going to be when the job title is gone, how you're going to find meaning in days that no longer have a built-in structure. That is considerably harder to put on a checklist. And so, without quite realizing we're doing it, we fixate on the thing we can control. We put enormous mental and emotional energy into the paid-off house because the paid-off house is finite and measurable and achievable, and what comes after it is not. I have a friend. I'll call her Patricia because she is a real person who worked alongside me for 12 years and would probably not love being named in a YouTube video, who spent the last 4 years before her retirement making extra payments every single month. She cut back wherever she could, delayed trips, scaled back celebrations. She told me once that she felt she couldn't make the decision to retire until the house was settled. "Once it's done," she said, "I'll know what I'm working with." I understood exactly what she meant. I also knew, in the part of my brain that had watched this particular pattern play out in more forms than I could count, that the house being done was not going to give her what she thought it was going to give her. It wasn't going to give her certainty. It was going to give her one less reason to delay, and then she was going to have to find another one. But first, let's talk about what it costs to get there. The most obvious cost is financial, and I'm not going to touch it because that's not my lane. But there are other costs, and these are the ones I watched accumulate quietly in people who are executing their plan perfectly. The first cost is time, not abstract future time, the years you'll have in retirement, what shows up on an actuarial table. I mean the specific, concrete, unrepeatable time of your 50s and early 60s. The years when you are, health-wise, still in the category of people who can do most things, who can travel without it becoming a logistics operation, who can hike or walk a city for hours, or stay up late 2 nights in a row without requiring 3 days to recover. I have a clear memory of a retirement party for a colleague, a woman in her mid-60s who had worked at the same organization for over 20 years. She stood up to give her remarks and said something I have not forgotten. She said, "I spent 12 years telling myself I'd travel when I retired, and now I'm retiring and my knees have developed some opinions about the matter." She was laughing when she said it, the room laughed, but I watched her face right after the laugh, and what was there was not funny. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with arriving somewhere too late. Not too late in the dramatic sense, not health catastrophe too late, but too late in the quieter sense. Too late to do the thing you told yourself the arrival would finally make possible. The knees are a specific example, but the knees are not really the point. The point is that you spent years counting on a version of your future self that you cannot now fully inhabit. And you can't quite explain why you're sad at your own retirement party, because from the outside, everything looks like exactly what you worked for. I think about that woman often. I think about her because there were signs for years before that party that she was in deferred mode. She talked about travel the way people talk about things they fully intend to do but haven't quite decided to do yet. It was always future tense, always conditional. And nobody, including me, and I would like to be honest about this, nobody around her said, "Why are you waiting? What is the specific thing you are waiting for?" The second cost is presence. And this one is harder to see while you're in it. When you make the payoff the goal, when that number is what you're running toward, your attention, even when you're not actively thinking about it, is partially somewhere else. You're at dinner and you're calculating. You're on vacation and you're tracking what it costs. You're watching your daughter with your grandchildren, and you're doing the quiet math in the back of your head about whether you could retire a year earlier if you tightened things another notch. I'm not exaggerating. I watched this happen. And I watched it happen to careful, self-aware people who would have told you, if you'd asked, that they had their priorities straight. People who genuinely believed they had their priorities straight. My own version of this was not about a mortgage. Tom and I made different choices, and I'll leave it at that. But I had my own version of the deferred life. Mine was built around the job, around being the person other people needed. For 27 years, I was so useful to so many people that I never really had to ask whether I was present in my own life, because I was always fully occupied with being present in theirs. The job was the perfect alibi, and when it was gone, I discovered that I had no idea what I was like when nobody needed anything from me. That was genuinely disorienting in a way I was not prepared for. I had planned for a lot of things. I had not planned for that. There is a term that comes up in organizational psychology. I used it in leadership training for years, called goal fixation. It describes what happens when the focus required to achieve a difficult goal starts to narrow your field of vision so completely that you stop seeing what is right in front of you. The goal is freedom, but the pursuit of that particular version of freedom becomes its own kind of cage. Patricia got her house paid off 8 months before her target date, which tells you something about the level of focus she'd applied. She called me, and the relief in her voice was real. She was genuinely happy, and I was genuinely happy for her. She took Tom and me out to dinner to celebrate. And then she went home and couldn't sleep for a week. She told me later that it felt like she had been running very hard toward a wall, and then the wall suddenly wasn't there. Not the wall falling down in a triumphant way, just the absence of it. And she kept finding herself braced for the impact that wasn't coming. That's where the mystery starts to open up, because this is the part nobody tells you about in advance. You get there, you make the final payment, you do the thing you have been working toward for years. And instead of clarity, what you find is a kind of spaciousness that has no furniture in it. Patricia described it to me about 2 months after the payoff. She said, "I thought I'd feel settled, but I feel unmoored. Like I was rowing toward this bank for years, and I got there, and now I'm standing on it, and I don't know what direction anything is." I recognize that feeling. Not from my mortgage. Tom and I made different choices along the way, and I made my peace with them. But from my own retirement. That precise experience of arriving somewhere you've been working toward and discovering that the arriving is not, in fact, the thing. And here's what I think is actually happening in that moment. The paid-off house represents a version of retirement that is complete, perfect, invulnerable. A retirement in which everything is in order, nothing can go wrong, and you are finally in a position of unconditional safety. That retirement does not exist. Not because the numbers don't work out. Again, I'm not in that conversation. But because safety is not a condition you achieve, it's a feeling. And feelings don't live in property records or account balances. They live in how you relate to your own life, in whether you can actually be present in it. The retirement most of us were raised to imagine, the one that looks like a clean finish line, a paid-off house, a perfectly organized handoff from career to freedom, that vision was never really about retirement at all. It was about permission. We have this idea, and I think this is particularly true among women of our generation who built serious careers in environments that constantly asked us to justify our presence, that we have to earn the right to stop, to rest, to exist without being productive. And the paid-off house becomes the proof, the credential, the evidence that we did everything right and can now, finally, allow ourselves to relax. But here is what I learned in my first year of retirement, which was one of the most professionally disorienting experiences of my life. There is no credential that grants you permission to be present in your own life. You either give yourself that permission or you don't. And if you haven't learned to give it to yourself before the house is paid off, paying off the house is not going to teach you. That's the deeper thing. That's what I want to name directly, because I think it's at the center of this. The mistake I'm talking about, and I mean mistake with real weight, not as a provocative title, is not a financial one. It's what happens in your head. The internal agreement you make without quite realizing you've made it that says, I will start living fully after the house is paid off, after I retire, after the children are settled, after my health situation stabilizes, After the grandchildren are a little older. After I have more clarity about what I want to do. After. I spent 27 years in human resources listening to people tell me what they were going to do after. After the project wrapped. After the promotion came through. After the reorganization was finished. The after is an extraordinarily crowded place. Very few people ever actually get there because after is not a location, it's a habit of thought. It's what happens when you've spent decades training yourself to defer presence in favor of preparation. The paid-off house, for a lot of people approaching retirement, is the final after, the one they've been working toward for 30 years. And when they arrive, when the last payment clears, they discover that the after they imagined still feels somehow like a before. Because they've spent 30 years preparing, they've had almost no practice being present. Tom said something to me. This is probably 18 months into my retirement, when I was still circling, still looking for the next thing to fix or complete or optimize. He said, "You keep looking for the version of this that's going to feel right. What if the version that already exists is the one?" I didn't have an answer. I've thought about it almost every day since. What if the version that already exists is the one? Not the retirement where everything is settled, not the version where the house is paid off and the schedule is exactly right and you've found your purpose and your social life has reorganized itself beautifully. What if the incomplete, still figuring it out, imperfect version of your life right now? The one with the mortgage payment still on the calendar, and the plans that haven't worked out, and the watercolors you abandoned because you were terrible at them. What if that is actually the version of your life that is yours, the one you are in, the good enough life? I've been sitting with that phrase for a while now because I think it is one of the genuinely hard things for women like us to accept. We were not built for good enough. We were built for excellent or working toward excellent, or at least being accountable for the gap between where we are and where excellent would be. But the kind of retirement I actually want, the kind where I'm present in my own days, genuinely in them rather than just managing them, requires a different relationship to good enough. It requires being willing to live in the version of your life that already exists, rather than the version you're still optimizing toward. That is the thing the paid-off house will not give you. And here's what I want to say carefully, because I've spent most of this video being critical, and I don't want to leave you without a way forward. Patricia is doing well. She retired about 14 months ago. She and her husband drove up the coast of Oregon last fall, something she'd been talking about for 20 years. She sent me a photo of a lighthouse at sunset. She looked happy in a way that had nothing to do with what was in any account. But she also told me, over coffee a few weeks ago, that the first several months after retirement were harder than she expected. Not for financial reasons. Because she had spent so long organizing her attention around a single goal that, once the goal was achieved, she had no idea where to point herself. What helped her, what she told me specifically helped her, was doing exactly the work she'd been putting off. Not the big dramatic things, the small, unimpressive, entirely undramatic practice of being in her life as it was. Having a day with no goals. Taking a walk with nowhere to go. Sitting with the discomfort of an afternoon that wasn't going anywhere in particular. I know that work. I did it, badly, in my first year. Because I'm a woman who spent 27 years being useful to other people and had very little practice at being present in my own life without an agenda attached to it. The retirement dream, the clean finish line, the paid-off house, the perfectly organized transition from work to freedom is appealing partly because it allows you to defer that work indefinitely. It says, once you arrive, the rest will follow. But the rest doesn't follow automatically. The rest is what you build deliberately out of the days you are actually in. And what I have come to believe 3 years into this is this: you do not need a perfect financial condition to practice being present in your life. You can start that work now, in the house that still has a mortgage on it, with the retirement that is not quite what you planned, in the life that is good enough, which is to say, the life that is yours. That is not a financial position, it is a decision. So here is what I want to say before I close, and I want to say it as a commitment rather than a conclusion, because I am still working on this myself. I am committing to being in my life as it is, not as I planned it, not as it will be once some future condition is met, but as it actually exists right now. On a Tuesday morning in Columbus, in the house Tom and I have been in since 1993, with the plant I almost killed twice and brought back, and the book club I've been in for 11 years, and the herb garden that cooperates, and the tomato garden that does not. This version, this one, that is my commitment. And if you're willing to make one, if there's something you have been putting off until the conditions are right, one way you've been telling yourself you'll really start living once some future thing gets sorted, I would genuinely like to hear it in the comments. Not to make this a better comment section, though it probably will, but because I think something real happens when you say a thing out loud. When you name it, it becomes something you're actually accountable to. What are you waiting for conditions to be right for? And what would it look like to decide that the conditions you already have are enough? I'm Linda Calloway. This is The Unretiring. If this kind of conversation is what you've been looking for, I'll be here.